And I think we'll get started. So welcome all of you to Southwest Minnesota Arts Council's workshop this evening on reaching underserved and underrepresented communities. I am Carolyn Koska. I'm the grants administrator here at Southwest Minnesota Arts Council, or SMAC. And I'm also joined tonight by my colleague, Crystal Lawaji. She will be keeping track of the chat as you all have some questions. And as we get going, here's our agenda of what we'll be talking about tonight. We'll look at some definitions. We'll talk about why SMAC is asking about underserved and underrepresented communities, how to figure out who might be underserved or underrepresented in your community, how you can reach out to those groups, some strategies for working with accessibility, and just some overall strategies for your organization for how to add this work to what you're already doing. So starting with some of our definitions, the first term that we're going to look at is underserved. What do we mean by this? In the most general sense, this would be people who are lacking access to necessary resources, services, or support in the community. In more of an arts sense, this would be people who have historically been left outside of participation in the arts because of discrimination, low income, and other factors. And then most specifically for your organization, people who are not currently being served by or engaging with your organization. Our next term that we're going to look at is underrepresented. And this would be defined as people who don't have enough representation in decision making, people whose representation in your organization or audience is disproportionately low compared to their numbers in your community, and also people whose contributions to the arts have been under-recognized. In considering which groups in your community might be underserved or underrepresented, you might examine or think about characteristics like, is there a particular race or ethnicity that might be underserved, language, national origin, a particular socioeconomic level, education level, religion, a particular age group, gender, sexual orientation, or degree of ability. So why is SMAC asking about people who might be underserved or underrepresented as part of our grant application process? And why are we asking for organizations to actively engage with people in those groups? I think we can all agree that all people deserve art in their lives, but there are definitely access gaps and barriers for some groups. SMAC as an organization is a steward of public funds, so we have both the opportunity and the responsibility to ensure that everyone living in our region has access to arts experiences. And because of that, we are committed to breaking down barriers and building bridges to participation in the arts for everyone. And this work is also to your community's advantage. It's not just a requirement, but as an organization, you can have increased connectivity in your community. You can improve the economic strength of your community by supporting the cultural and artistic expression of all of your residents. And we want to remember that reaching out to new communities is not about displacing or alienating current audiences, but expanding and deepening existing engagement. And this quote is from a great tool called An Introduction to Engaging Diverse Audiences that's put together by the Regional Arts and Cultural Council of Oregon. It's a great tool to use to kind of walk your organization through this process. I definitely referenced it in putting together this workshop, but I definitely recommend it if your organization is looking for something to kind of work from. It is an older resource, so a lot of the additional links that they have within that are not available at the moment, but I still, as an overall tool for your organization, I would still recommend it. You can find this document by searching online for the title, and I'm also going to hopefully stick a link in the chat here for you. So we're going to go through most of this tonight centered around answering our application questions, but your organization can definitely use this information separately from our application process. So the first part of the application question that you'll run into is describe the groups in your community that are underserved or underrepresented. So the first piece of figuring that out is to take a look at your community in general. What does your community look like? And some resources that you can find out more about your community are compass.org, the US Census. Your local government may have some information and service organizations in your community. We're going to take a look at both of these, MinCompass and US Census here. So this is Minnesota Compass, and most of the data from here does come from the US Census, but it's presented a lot more simply. One thing to be aware of, it does not include towns that have a population under 1,000. So that's something to be aware of there. But some of the things that you'll find, they've got a couple of little infographics at the top for your community, just as a quick look. And then they've got information on a bunch of different demographic areas. One thing to note with this, when you see something that's marked suppressed, that is nothing to be concerned about. It's either a very small number that might be identifiable in that community, or it's a number that has a larger margin of error around it. But you can see that these still add up to a significant amount of the community. But there's just some different statistics that you can take a look at. And again, a little more basic, a little more simplified, either a good place to start, or depending on your community, you could get what you need from here. Now we're going to jump over to our same city, Tracy, on the census page, US Census. So this goes into a lot more detail, can be a little more overwhelming because of that, not quite as visually friendly looking. It does include those very small towns that we're missing from the MinCompass site, and it does go into, as I said, more detail. So here's just a quick look at what that looks like. So you can tell there are a lot more data points that it takes a look at. And I'll just scroll through so you can see what all is there. And you'll see when we get to, we looked at the race and ethnicity section over on the MinCompass site. And here you can see it does go into a lot more detail. So you could come over here if you are needing that more detail. So for all of these data sites that you're taking a look at, just keep in mind that the information might be less accurate for more marginalized people, and that's another place where they might be underrepresented. So let's say you found out this information. Here's again some sample data taken both from Encompass and the US Census from the city of Tracy. So we found out how the different ages are divided out in the community, same with race and ethnicity. And we just pulled a couple statistics about people with disabilities, households below poverty level, veterans. So now you've got this data, and the first thing you want to do is not just take this data and plop it into the application as your answer for this question. This is just your community demographics. You need to do some interpreting in order to figure out who might be underserved or underrepresented in your community. So some things that you could do to do a little more of that interpreting piece. You could do something like compare some of these numbers to state averages. The US Census site has averages that it compares to for all of these demographics. So for instance, people with disabilities, the Minnesota average is 12%. So we can tell in this community we have a higher percentage of people with disabilities. Our households below poverty level, the state average is 9%. Again, at 13% here, this has a higher percentage. And veterans, our state average is 6%. So again, we've got a higher percentage of veterans. So that's something we might want to find out. Then there might be some areas where you want some more details. So when we were just looking at the Encompass site, we kind of ended up with other people of color. We definitely want more details on that. So if we went over to the US Census, we could find out what they are made up, this last 9%. We also might want to find out things like what portion of some of these races or ethnicities are immigrants. What portion might speak another language at home? With our people with disabilities, we might want to find out what disabilities do they have, just so we know how we might better serve them. With our older adults, we might want to know what percentage of them are in care facilities. Some of these are a good place to check with your local government and service organizations to find out specific details for your community. So once you've done more of this work and dug into the data a little more, then you can really look at who might lack access to those necessary resources, services, or support in the community. And those would be people who then could be considered generally underserved in the community. The next piece of this is taking a look at your organization. So who makes up the leadership for your organization? What kinds of characteristics do your participants and audience members have? Who are your artists and what kind of characteristics are related to your programming? And I know a lot of organizations are already doing surveys regularly, so you probably already have information about age, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic level, ability of your participants and audience, and who makes up your actual organization. So now you would take your organization, audience, artist makeup, and compare that to your community. Are there any groups that you have low or no engagement from? Who isn't included in your decision making? Who isn't included in your activities or in representation of art and artists in your programming? Is anyone being left out because of specific barriers? Or your organization may already be focused around an underserved or underrepresented group and be serving that group already. One sidebar here. In some ways, our whole Southwest Minnesota region could be considered geographically underserved. It is a given that your organizations are providing arts access and opportunities that otherwise wouldn't be present in our rural region, and we thank you for that. But in that regard, we are all in the same boat. So being overall geographically underserved is not really what we're looking at. We need to acknowledge that we do already have a pretty vibrant art scene across our region. It's not a case of we're in Southwest Minnesota, so we don't have anything. So saying that being in this region, your whole community is underserved, so all of your activities serve the underserved already. That's not really answering this question. Instead, we want you to look at what needs are more specific to your particular community or organization. You can look at local access to your organization's activities. Maybe there's a particular spot in your service area that has some extra access barriers or lack of participation. So looking at what we have come up with these two pieces, your community and your specific organization, you should now have a pretty good picture of who might be underserved or underrepresented, and you should be able to describe those groups in the application question. So that should cover part one of your application. And we will take a little break for a second for any questions. So feel free to either unmute yourself and ask a question or type something into the chat. Anything that we can answer for you at the moment? Crystal, did we have anything that has come in on chat?
Nope, no questions from chat.
All right. We will keep moving. And if you think of something as we go along and want to just type it into the chat while you have it fresh in your mind, we can get to that at our next question break. So moving on to our next part of the application question, you are asked what are some specific things you will do to reach out to or involve one or more of the underserved or underrepresented groups that you identified so that they can participate in your project. The question also says that the phrase, our activities are open to everyone, does not answer this question. You are asked to come up with some specific actions that you're going to take. And again, here, your organization may already consist of and primarily serve members of the group that you are focusing on. So you have a chance to talk about that as well. So using the information that you gathered about who might be underserved or underrepresented, who do you want to focus on for this particular project? It might be a segment of your current audience that you want to increase attendance. It could be a group that doesn't have any engagement so far with your organization. It could be a group that has come to you with particular needs or you've learned about in the community. It could be a group that is a particularly good fit with a project you have in mind, possibly a good fit with some just current priorities that your organization has or with your organization mission. And also, as you're thinking about this, think about kind of a more comprehensive plan for future outreach in addition to your target groups for this particular project. So now you've chosen a group, and instead of just moving ahead with your guesses of what you could do for these groups, it's best to start relationships with them. And the first step toward building those relationships is just making those initial connections. And there are various people and organizations that could help you do that and kind of be your first connection with your target groups, depending on the kind of group that you are wanting to work with. This could be cultural organizations, community health workers and organizations, youth programs, K-12 liaisons in the schools, spiritual leaders or churches, service organizations, libraries, ethnic grocery stores, community education, offices of diversity and inclusion in your nearest community college or university. So lots of options, kind of inroads to make those first connections. Once you have made those first connections, you can start learning and gathering information, building some trust with that group. Good to start with just some informal gatherings, other relationship building conversations, and ask about cultural interests, needs, any barriers they are aware of. And for these kinds of gatherings, sharing food can be a great icebreaker, and really consider in conversation with them why you haven't had engagement in the past. Is it to do with the relevance of your programming to them, economic barriers, just the fact that there hasn't been any relationship building in the past? And then with permission or invitation, you can also participate in their activities and celebrations. Don't just expect them to come to your events. You can extend invitations for members of that group to be part of your planning or leadership, or also work as volunteers if they have interest in that. You'll want to be aware, though, that an individual is not able to represent the entire community, but they may have some connections or insights to share and start feeling more included. You'll also want to be aware if there are any other organizations in your community that are wanting to reach the same groups that you are targeting, and consider collaborating so that you're not each doing all the work yourselves. Another option is to consider a SMAC grant for these activities. You could look at our Quick Support for Organizations grant that is available for up to $2,500. And you would want to look at the Arts Organization Development project type for these kinds of activities. And then sometimes there are artists that you can bring in that have some of this community engagement as part of their art practice. And you could do something like an art project grant for that, and those are available for up to $7,000. So the next step would be to use this info you've begun gathering to inform your programming and your events. You could think about the relevance and appeal that your current programming might have to these target groups. You would want to think about including artists or elements or traditions from the specific culture or demographic in your programming with the guidance and or permission from those community members. Also build into your actual event planning, addressing any barriers that you know of. And also focus on making sure that your events that you are inviting these groups to are welcoming for them. Consider the sort of atmosphere and space that you're welcoming them into. Maybe you might want to have some people that they're familiar with there to meet them and help them join in. Maybe they need some translation services. And even you could do things like pre-show introductions, behind-the-scene tours, just to increase the welcome for new people coming into your program. You'll also want to think about how you are communicating all of this as you're putting together your marketing plans. Reconnect with those initial people you have been working with. They can help you figure out the best ways to communicate with your target group. Which communication methods do they tend to use most often? Are there community gathering spaces where physical posters or flyers would be effective? Are there particular social media platforms or pages they follow? Are they likely or unlikely to consume more traditional media like radio or newspaper? Is translation into certain languages helpful or not? Do they respond to advertising in general, or is word of mouth more effective? So really just find out for the group that you're targeting, what is most effective for them. Also, as you've been working on getting rid of some barriers, make sure people know about that. Show that any challenges to participation have been reduced or eliminated. Just make sure that people know about some of those important changes that you're making. Another piece of your communication might be providing information about what to expect when attending a particular kind of event. What generally happens at a gallery opening, a play, a concert? Is there a certain way people normally dress when doing those things? If you're arriving, what is the entrance like? Are there stairs involved? Is there an accessible restroom? Just kind of providing that info ahead of time to make people feel more comfortable about what to expect. And then finally, reaching out proactively with direct invitations to individuals. So now that you've kind of pulled together a more comprehensive outreach plan, you can pull out specific actions that pertain to your current grant project, and you can answer part 2 of that application question. And then after your project or event, keep reaching out and working on the relationships with those groups. Just reaching out once for the one project isn't going to create some continuity of participation from that group. So it is an ongoing relationship. And we'll stop again here if there are any questions.
Carolyn, I don't have any questions in chat, but from before, not a question, but just to let you know that there was someone that said they appreciated all their resources shared so far. So
good to hear. We'll keep moving along. So now we're coming to our third and last part of the application question. And this is, how will you ensure that the project will be accessible to those with various disabilities? If you have an ADA access plan, how does that inform your planning for this project? First of all, what is ADA? This is the Americans with Disabilities Act from 1990, and it addresses the needs of people with disabilities and prohibits discrimination in employment, public services, public accommodations, and telecommunications. If you offer anything to the public, you are required to provide equal access by identifying and removing barriers to participation or providing reasonable accommodations. And an ADA access plan is just a simple document that you can put together that describes your organization's plan to comply with the ADA. Doesn't need to be in any particular format or require any sort of expertise, just something that your organization can put together. In order to start either putting together an access plan or thinking about this part of the application question, you might want to consider doing an accessibility audit. And this is really just thinking about what barriers people with disabilities might encounter when engaging with your programming. And there are several types of impairments or differences to consider when you're thinking about this. It could be sensory differences, how people sense the world, including things like seeing, hearing, sensory processing. It could be differences related to mobility, flexibility, body structure, how a body is reacting with the environment. It could be cognitive differences related to developmental, intellectual, and social skills, differences related to communication, psychological or psychiatric differences, all things that you can consider in thinking about what kinds of barriers people might encounter. And if this sounds kind of scary, there are lots of tools available that you can use to walk you through this kind of an audit. Over here, this is a little snippet from the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council's workbook for small arts organizations. And I don't know if you can actually read any of this, but it talks about things in the visual arts about exhibit labels and space between aisles of an exhibit. Is the floor surface safe, etc. So just a whole bunch of details for you to consider. And we will just look at a few more resources here next. On our website, if you go over to the Access tab, we have a page that talks about SMAC's accessibility offerings, but also it has a bunch of resources for you there. This Arts Midwest Creating an Accessibility Plan is a really good place to start for just getting going in thinking about creating a plan. The VSA checkpoints for access questionnaire is a basic higher level questionnaire to get you started evaluating. With the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council, their Arts Accessibility Planning Workbook, we looked at the example in the past slide, is a very detailed accessibility audit workbook for you. And they also have some other resources like lists of services. And then we also link to the accessibility resources on Springboard for the Arts, Minnesota State Arts Board, Minnesota Council on Disability, and the federal ADA website. So there are a lot of resources out there if you would like to get started on this kind of project. Once you have thought about where there might be barriers, what can you come up with for solutions? This probably is going to require some research. You might want to look at some industry standards and how other organizations might have solved similar issues. What resources might be needed from your organization as far as costs and time. And then once you have done that research, come up with some solutions, you'll want to prioritize those. You definitely will not be able to do everything immediately. Not everything might even be feasible, but are there things that are kind of low-hanging fruit that you could easily do? Are there things that people have requested or that affect a good portion of your audience? And then once you have prioritized and have kind of some top things that you are that seem feasible to you, go ahead and create some specific goals for yourself with a clear timeline, assign tasks to specific roles or individuals within your organization, and then you have your ADA access plan. Make sure that you set up a schedule to periodically review your plan to see both if the goals are being reached or if you need to adapt things as needs or technology change. As far as next steps, now that you have your ADA plan, you can again pull out specific actions that pertain to your current grant project to answer that part 3 of your application question. So now we have answered all of the parts of that question. Another next step to think about is a grant for accessibility improvements. You could again look at that Quick Support for Organizations grant. This time you'd want to look at the small equipment purchase type or the larger equipment and facilities improvement grant for up to $10,000. But both of these are centered around arts organizations specifically. And we'll take one more pause here for questions.
Oh, I do have a question in the chat. This is relating to the ADA compliance slide, one of the first ones in this section. The question was, can you give examples or expectations of reasonable accommodation?
That is very specific to kind of the issue. And Crystal could certainly speak to this as well. She is our accessibility coordinator. So if there's anything you'd like to pipe in with here.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the reasonable accommodations can have to do sometimes with a timeline. You know, if someone asks for you to have a sign language interpreter there, but they're asking the day of the event, well, that's not really a reasonable accommodation. But if they ask you 3 weeks in advance, then you probably should at least look into hiring someone. And if there's a whole bunch of barriers that are in your way of hiring someone, then you at least have to like document what those barriers are, to show that you did your due diligence in trying to get that that accessibility component in there. And there's other things too, you know, like if they're requesting a larger seat, or if they're requesting a seat that has space next to it that they can sit next to someone with a wheelchair, then those are things that if they ask enough in advance, it's probably something that you might be able to get, to rent a seat or to take some seats out of your theater, you know, things like that. So it's very specific, like Carolyn said, to the request. So the reasonable accommodation part is if it's a request that you can't do, then you have to document kind of why you can't do it. And if it's a request that you get, then you should record it. And in the future, that would be a priority to make that happen in future shows or in future years when you're making that sort of accessibility plan. So it is a lot of just kind of documenting that it was requested, documenting what you did to get it, if it was successful or not, but then putting that on a priority list in the future, I would say.
Thank you. And I will say that accessibility is like a whole nother huge topic that we're not really fully diving into here. So yeah, but thank you, Crystal. That was some good information. Any other questions at the moment?
I don't have any more in chat.
All right, we are just moving right along. So we have talked about a lot of stuff, and we recognize that this can be a lot of work and investment of time and resources for your organization. You're going to be getting to know your community in depth, identifying barriers, starting and maintaining long-term relationships with groups in your community, doing the work to remove barriers by changing the way you do things and likely changing some of your programming. So what can your organization do? What are strategies to really be able to even take on some of this work? The big thing is planning ahead. Don't wait to start these processes as you're filling out your application. Try and make it more part of how your organization operates. Maybe start at another time of the year in preparation for this. For instance, making initial connections with communities before you even determine what your project is going to be. And don't think about this as just a requirement for a grant project. This really is an ongoing responsibility to your community. So because of that, make sure you are giving yourself plenty of time for that. Also, you can consider grant funding to help with parts of the process. We talked about what grants SMAC might have available, but there may be other funders as well who might be interested in these kinds of projects, perhaps your local community foundation. So this isn't something that you have to necessarily try and do all on your own. There could be funding that you can get for some of these processes. And then once you've kind of started and made some progress on this work, it'll be a lot easier to answer these application questions for each grant project. So you'll already know most of the information and strategies, and it'll be easy to just pull out what you need and make a few modifications for your current project. So of course, as your community changes and needs change, you'll need to reassess. But once you kind of got this initial work done, it'll be a lot easier to answer those application questions. And then finally, just talking about expectations. Through this process, your programming or art forms might start to look a little different than what you're used to seeing, but also you are not expected to be all things to all people. You still want to focus on your mission. So there may be some change, but keep focusing on the thing that you do. Also, we don't expect that you're going to be able to get to all of the groups on your list right away or see instant results with the groups you're focusing on. This can really take a lot of time before you start seeing significant results. So just, again, be aware of that in your expectations. And then our grant reviewers are really just looking for continuing efforts and gradual improvement, basically evidence that you are trying. So these criteria, as they're being scored, are measured by are you making appropriate efforts, not necessarily are you getting amazing outcomes. Again, we realize that this takes a lot of time and a lot of work. And just be aware that we're really looking for the effort and not necessarily the outcome, at least in your application that you are putting together. So that was all of the information that I wanted to cover tonight. Just a reminder that we are recording. This will be posted on our website afterwards. And those of you who registered will get an email once this recording is available. And then we can take any more questions that you might have to finish off. Otherwise, that was all of the content I was hoping to cover anyway.
So Carolyn, we do have a question in chat. If you have any examples of how organizations have attempted to reach underrepresented groups.
What we see a lot is translations of advertising and programs and posters. We haven't seen as much of really the long-term relationship building and kind of finding out what people what people's needs really are. And so that is something that we'd like people to do more of. But I will say the translation is one of the bigger things that we see. We've seen some helping with transportation, like a little bus going around and picking up people who aren't able to come to the event on their own. We've seen things like providing recordings to people who weren't able to come that might get played at a nursing home or something. Was any of that helpful or not quite what people were looking for?
No, if I may just speak to what our work in Worthington with the symphony, we've
Sure.
tried that with bus provided for the community education classes in the evening, and we didn't get the results we wanted. We offered it several times, but I guess through time, like you say, building the relationships, I see our best effort happening when we include our students on a number and getting their parents there to come see their kids, and keeping our ticket prices low and posters. I appreciate you confirming these things. Translated to Spanish, and but again, we haven't done advertising in Spanish. But yeah, just keep trying to build the relationships, and we don't always know how effective, we are until later on down the line. So.
Kind of related to that question, I've been on a lot of grant panels, so I've seen a lot of the things you're talking about, but has there been something really uniquely outstanding that somebody reached a group that really was surprising and like, wow, why didn't anybody think of this before?
Off the top of my head, I have to say, this is a question that I was not prepared for.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think some of the ones that have generally scored better are projects that are considering more than one group. I know that's not necessarily something really outside of the box, but to really think beyond just like the one thing that you could do.
And sort of related, what is SMAC most proud of that you guys have done to diversify and reach a underserved group?
We've done a lot with working with our actual application process and trying to make that as accessible as possible, not just in a disability accessibility way, but things like we used to, for a very long time, give out our grants where you would get 80% at the beginning of your project, and then you'd get 20% once you had finished. And just hearing from people that that could be a real burden to try and finish their project without the full grant funds. So that's definitely a change that we've made.
The grant process is much, much better. So thank you for all your work on streamlining it and making it less complicated and intense.
Is there anything you'd like to add, Crystal?
I don't know, it's such a big question, like there's like all the different parts of it, like I'm happy about at least the initiative and work kind of that we've put towards updating our kind of ADA goals and making that document and making kind of stuff like that. Like I'm glad that that's happening. And just thinking about I was thinking about those kind of ways that you can get some target groups or underrepresented groups to care about your events or the relevance. Like, you might be able to build in some of these grant applications or the smaller kind of projects to build in a service that you actually do in those communities. I'm thinking about, we did a session, and now I'm actually forgetting if it was Upper Sioux or Lower Sioux, but where we were there for a day and we provided professional photography for their artwork so that they could have work samples that looked professional. Carolyn and Nicole were there to talk about projects and to go through the grant questions and things like that. So if there's a way that you can think about having a project that's maybe not even for the whole public, but if you're trying to reach a specific community, to go in that community and to give them something, that they need or that they have requested, so that you just start to build those relationships that then they're much interested to sort of give back in coming to your events that you're doing and things like that. So I guess maybe sometimes thinking about a give and take relationship and not.
Looks like Crystal has frozen there. Sorry about that. Looks like
my Zoom, I didn't know what happened. I was like, it paused and I thought maybe just my internet went out.
I was just glad we didn't lose everybody. So anything else, questions or anything anyone would like to talk about yet? All right, well, thanks for joining us. It was good to see all of you here, and we will have a recording of this available. You'll get an email when that's ready. It might be a week or so before we have that up for you, but you can look out for that. And again, if you have any ideas related to grants for this, I am happy to talk about that. So
this was very helpful. It really gave me more specifics to work toward to get those answers and for our organization to work toward. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I think even for us, this is an ongoing process. It takes a lot of time. So don't be discouraged, but keep trying stuff.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.